Welcome, everyone. My name is Francesca Iacorto, and I'm an advisory board member of the Pearson Centre. I'm also the Senior Director of Public Affairs at the National Airlines Council of Canada. As many of you will know, the Pearson Centre is a progressive centrist think tank that addresses the big economic and social challenges of the day. In that context, I'm pleased to welcome you to the 10th webinar on major policy issues related to COVID-19 and how they are affecting our society. Today, we will discuss the economics of this COVID period and the recovery that lies ahead with a leading Canadian economist. Before doing that, though, I'm going to take a few moments to thank two sustaining sponsors without whose help these webinars would not be possible. They are, first, Canada's Building Trades Unions, and second, the International Association of Firefighters. So a very big thank you to both organizations. Now back to our guest. Dr. Jim Stanford holds the position of Economist and Director of the Centre for Future Work, which is a part of the Australia Institute. He's currently based in Vancouver. He is a leading progressive Canadian economist and for many years was the chief economist at Unifor and was the founder of the Progressive Economics Forum. Jim is the author of several books, including Economics for Everyone, A Short Guide to the Economics of Capitalism. Today's webinar will be moderated by Andrew Cardozo, who's the president of the Pearson Centre and who also writes a regular column for the Hill Times. With respect to the format, the discussion will last about 30 minutes before we turn it over to you, the audience, for a Q&A session, and we plan on wrapping up around 3:40 p.m. Eastern. Please use the question box on your screen and we will get to as many questions as we can. This session is being recorded and will be posted on the Pearson YouTube channel later on this afternoon. So on that note, over to you, Andrew.
Thank you, Francesca, and welcome, Jim Stanford. It's great to have you on the Pearson podium, and welcome back to Canada after you spent a couple of years in Australia.
Thank you, Andrew. Thank you, Francesca.
Yeah, so we're chatting here today, interesting day, July the 6th. It's the day before the Finance Minister, Bill Morneau, will be issuing his financial snapshot, which is the closest thing to a budget or economic statement. So it's an interesting day to be having this conversation. But Jim, let me ask you, in general, we are facing the most calamitous economic situation in Canada and the world over that we've seen for a very long time, if not ever. How do you see us recovering from this? What's needed from the private sector and what's needed from government?
Well, you're right, Andrew. This is absolutely uncharted terrain that we're in. And the data continues to flow in to show just how dramatic the impact of the pandemic and the health restrictions have been on our economy. For example, we get a monthly GDP report from Statistics Canada, and we've seen a 7% decline in March and an 11% decline in April. So that means we're down 18% from where we were before the pandemic hit. And frankly, that's a bigger drop in GDP than we saw during the entire extent of the Great Depression in the 1930s. So, and it happened in a matter of weeks. So it's a completely unprecedented situation that's going to absolutely challenge the staying power and the flexibility and the goodwill and the solidarity of our economy and our society. I think Canadians have a lot to be proud of how we've responded to the pandemic. Certainly, just cast your eyes southward to the United States, and then we're all thankful for what we've been able to do in Canada and the I would say the foundation of social trust and social cohesion that has supported us. But there's also no doubt we're in for a long, hard road. It's not just going to be a recovery. I hesitate to even use the word recovery. That makes it sound like sort of a normal cyclical dip. And, you know, just a little bit of Keynesian pump priming, and lo and behold, we'll be back to where we need to be. This is going to be something different. I've likened it to reconstruction after a war. Kind of analogous to rebuilding industrial economies after World War II. And, you know, we are fighting a war. We're fighting a war against disease and contagion. And I think it's going to require a sustained government leadership from the public sector in all kinds of ways for many years. It's not going to be a quick V-shaped recovery at all. I think we're going to have obviously the private sector will play a role, but the private sector doesn't have the capacity to ignite a sustained process of reconstruction, because individual consumers, of course, have been shocked by what's happened and their confidence is broken and their incomes have shrunk. Individual businesses are deeply worried about what comes next. The uncertainty around future waves of infection obviously is going to hold back businesses from leading a recovery in a normal way. Only government has the authority and the capacity to act and the unlimited financial resources to try and get the macroeconomic ball rolling. And we're going to need for several years, once the health emergency passes or at least abates a bit, we're going to need for several years government to play a leading role in leading investment, including in physical and social infrastructure, meeting immediate service needs, providing income support in all kinds of ways to Canadians, and direct hiring in the public sector to create jobs. It's going to be a very different economy that we rebuild to.
Well, when you talk about staying power, you're talking about staying power of the private sector and businesses, small and big, to stay the course. What's your sense of how that's going to happen? We're hearing lots of stories about small businesses that, have been working with very small margins to begin with, going under bit by bit. Do you think we're going to have a lot of bankruptcies taking place?
I do, and frankly, I'm worried that we haven't seen the worst of it yet. There were the initial shutdowns, of course, ordered by public health. They were experienced most dramatically in the kind of consumer-facing, sort of face-to-face, hands-on industries like retail, hospitality, personal services, entertainment, transportation, and those are places that had to shut down immediately. Now, the government's done a lot to try and help both the businesses and the workers in those industries survive without losing their viability, including the wage subsidy plan. The idea there was to keep workers attached to their employers so that when things are allowed to reopen, they can come back quickly. However, the longer it goes on, the harder it is for businesses to survive. And I suspect that we're going to need some more government support financially. I also think we should look at, this is more in the provincial jurisdiction, just direct restrictions on normal bankruptcy and liquidation processes. Given what's happened, there's no reason that you should force a company, small, medium, or even large, into bankruptcy because it can't meet immediate liquidity needs. And just borrowing more from the bank at interest, with interest, is not going to do the trick. So I think we're going to need some extraordinary measures to protect businesses from bankruptcy claims, to protect homeowners and renters from losing their homes, and basically put a freeze on all of those kind of property type transactions until we're at a situation where we can get normal income flows going again.
So how would that work? You just you'd have businesses that can't pay their bills. They wouldn't go bankrupt. They'd just be kind of like in a dormant stage and not paying people or paying their creditors.
Yeah, I think there's lots of leeway. That's been tried in different countries. In Europe, there's several countries that have done that. It's also been applied, for example, on rental payments, both for residents, but also business rental payments, to just say, look, for 6 months, you're just not going to make rental payments. And that means a loss of income for the landlord, for sure. And otherwise freezing bankruptcy claims and creditor actions, I think would be a logical way to try and put a hold on that long-term damage. It's one thing to shut down for a few weeks or, hopefully not a few months. It's another thing to lose the viability and the equity and the brand and the presence of businesses, again, small, medium, and large, because of a pandemic like this. So the normal rules of the game, I think, have to be suspended in order to keep businesses, workers, and households all in a state where once we can get back to work, we will.
So let's get to the issue of the debt. And from what I understand, the latest figures, latest projections from the Parliamentary Budget Officer is that the debt is somewhere around 260 billion, the COVID debt. what you're suggesting, if the government has a longer term roll over several months or years, how high can we take that debt? And the second part of that is, how do we repay it?
Right. Yeah. Well, the 260, I hate to say this, isn't the debt. It's the deficit. It's just this year, just this year's addition to the debt. So the total debt, of course, is much larger than that based on what was accumulated in previous years. And I think it will probably be higher than 260 billion. We'll hear from the finance minister tomorrow, you know, their latest best guesses as to where it's going. But of course, it's a moving target. Nobody can, anyone who thinks they can predict what's going to happen in the next few months is a snake oil salesperson. This is obviously uncharted terrain, and we have to make it up as we go along. But I think that this year's deficit could be higher than that. We for example, since that PBO estimate came out, we've extended the CERB program for another 8 weeks. That will add, you know, another probably $15 billion to the expenses. And we don't really know what's going to happen to tax revenues this year, given how dramatically other things have shut down. So no doubt it's going to be a big number. No doubt big deficits are going to continue for years to come. You know, there's no way that we're going to snap back to what we were at before. But also, no doubt, the government's ability to finance these necessary expenditures is not in question at all. And if there's one lesson I think that we've all learned from the pandemic, it's that the old knee-jerk idea that the government has a piggy bank with a certain amount of money, and once the piggy bank is empty, then we all just have to suck it up and tighten our belts, is nonsense. We have a government that's able to mobilize resources, both real resources and financial resources, to protect Canadians to the best of their ability through a national emergency. When we were fighting World War II, you know, here's my war analogy again, we never stopped and said, gee, is it going to add to the deficit? You know, that question never came up. Of course it added to the deficit, and we came out of World War II with a debt much larger than it is today, 130% of GDP at the end of the war. And we never paid that back either. This idea that you then have to tighten your belts in order to pay back the debt is also nonsense. In fact, the government continued to run deficits most years, even after the war. But it also successfully led an ambitious post-war reconstruction plan that had the economy firing on all cylinders, including public infrastructure, the expansion of public services, industry policies that supported high-value manufacturing, and other things that led to a period of rapid economic growth. So the debt was never paid back, but the debt shrank in importance because the economy was growing successfully around it. And that exact recipe is what's going to be required now. We're going to come out of this crisis within a couple of years, you know, potentially with a debt to GDP ratio approaching 100% again. And, you know, there's some people, some of the debt hawks are going to say that's the stuff of nightmares, or we're going to hit the debt wall. That's nonsense. And it's been proven nonsense by the experience of the world economy over the last decade. Since the global financial crisis, most industrial countries have run large, consistent deficits, and it has not led to economic breakdown. It has not led to hyperinflation, where we have to take wheelbarrows of cash to go and buy a loaf of bread. It hasn't led to the end of capitalism as we know it. In fact, a country like Japan has debt, public debt equal to 250% of GDP today, and they've been very successful, including at addressing this pandemic. So I think that the old debt bogeyman scary time story has lost its credibility. And as long as the government and the Bank of Canada are prepared to be sensible and pragmatic and undertake these debts to meet the needs of Canadians at this moment, and then do the things that are required, including Bank of Canada purchases of government bonds to allow that to happen, the debt will not be a problem. It's the last thing that we should be worrying about. There's much more important things we need to worry about right now, like the health of ourselves and our loved ones.
So next week, this time, we have a webinar with Infrastructure Minister Catherine McKenna. What would be your recommendation to her? Because you mentioned the things that the government can be doing in terms of boosting a reconstruction and talking about construction infrastructure. That's one of the tools that governments have used in the past few years, is infrastructure. Is that going to be the biggest item? And what's your suggestion about what the government can be doing?
Well, infrastructure is always an important part of any kind of government economic strategy, and especially during an era of rebuilding. Frankly, I wouldn't say it's the most important thing. It's kind of a standard go-to item. If the economy is sluggish, well, let's get some big publicly funded infrastructure capital projects going, and it is good. It creates jobs, including in the construction industry. It also has long-term benefits in terms of improving the quality of life and the efficiency of our transportation system and our utilities and our cities, et cetera, et cetera. So yes, yes, yes. Infrastructure spending good. And to the minister, I would say go for it, go big, and be prepared to do it for a long time. Not a shovel-ready quick stimulus vision of what's required, but a 10-year plan to significantly increase the level of infrastructure spending and keep it there. And there's all kinds of projects, including green energy transition and public housing and digital infrastructure. We're all living on the internet these days, and gosh, we know that it could be better. On the other hand, I think it's wrong to put too much focus on infrastructure. There's other ways in which direct government spending, direct government employment, and direct government financing of economic activity is going to be even more important, including maintaining in some form these emergency income support measures, but also expanding in a permanent way government public service provision in areas like healthcare, long-term care, which was a disaster in this pandemic and has to be fixed and has to be brought under the umbrella of Medicare properly. Early childhood education, which we've learned is an essential service in order for parents, especially women, to be able to get back to work, and other public service areas. I think we're going to see a permanent increase in the size of government's economic footprint, including direct public service provision. And that will be even more important, I think, than increased infrastructure investments in order to meet those needs of long-run economic reconstruction that I was talking about.
So that's you have a solid reputation of being a leading progressive economist in Canada and elsewhere. You've outlined a very progressive approach to this recovery or rebuilding. What would you say, to the arguments that come from the other side, a more conservative approach to economic rebuilding, that we do need to pull down the debt, we need to cut back services? That debate is beginning a little bit, I think, but it's likely to become more prominent. What are your responses to that?
Well, first of all, Andrew, you're very charitable to call me a leading progressive economist. I appreciate that. I usually get called other words that I won't repeat on your webinar that have something to do with left-wing nut bar with no brains at all. But I think that those traditional arguments that government is a burden, that government is a barrier, that government is bloated, that red tape is what's holding back the economy, those arguments have lost so much of their power because of what's happened in the last few months. I think they'd lost a lot of their power anyway. But in the last few months, Canadians have opened their eyes and seen a number of things. Number one, government is essential to protect them. There's no force other than government that could have done what has happened in the last few months to protect Canadians from this horrible disease and its fallout, including its economic fallout. And that society is stronger when it happens. And that private businesses, the supposed all-knowing, always efficient, rational market system, private businesses, in a way, will run for the hills when something terrible happens, because they will be focused on protecting their own assets or protecting their own wealth or battening down the hatches. And when all private businesses batten down the hatches, then you go from a recession to a depression. We've also learned, again, as I was saying earlier, that there's no limit to the financial resources and real resources that government can mobilize when it needs to. So this idea that, well, this was just a few months, now we got to get back to a rigorous market-dominated, business-led economy is indeed, I think, a recipe for depression. If the government, the government, I think, deserves high marks for how it's responded ambitiously and flexibly to this crisis. If it now says, okay, that was the worst of the pandemic, now we've got to get real and tighten the belts and balance the budget, let alone repay the debt. God help us if someone in charge actually thinks we have to start trying to repay that debt. Then that austerity will not only forego the potential benefits of successful economic leadership by government, it will absolutely throw us into something like a sustained depression. And it was exactly that kind of advice, to tighten belts, balance budgets, cut wages to increase the incentive for private employers to hire people, et cetera, that created the Great Depression in the 1930s. And we have learned from that. So even my political advice, frankly, to conservatives who are making those types of arguments is you will be in the wilderness for a decade if you actually think that argument is going to win the hearts and minds of Canadians, because Canadians have seen firsthand why we need active, powerful government. We have 9 million Canadians right now receiving government income support to help them through this crisis. And are any of them going to have 5 minutes to listen to a conservative saying you've become lazy and you're coddled by the nanny state, and therefore, you know, it's time to tighten your belts? Those conservatives who adopt that type of language, honestly, will be marginalizing themselves from the real debates that we have for years to come.
Okay, can we switch gears just for a few minutes, and we'll come back to this topic with our questions. We've got some questions coming in, but I just want to focus a little bit on the future of work. The center that you run, the Center for Future Work. Share with us your thoughts about the future of work. You know, we were talking about it, the future of work changing rapidly in the past decade or so, but it's changed a whole lot in the last 3 months. What are your thoughts about how it's changing now? And as a corollary of that, what are the effects of remote working on the workplace and work in general?
Oh, that's a great question, and obviously,
a lot of stuff in there.
Yeah, obviously very timely. There's 5 million Canadians doing most or all of their work from home right now, and that has tripled since February because of the pandemic. And you know, I know that we joke about it. We kind of love to be in our pajamas. You know, or at least to just get dressed from the waist up. I can assure you I am wearing trousers that match the suit jacket here. And, you know, watch Netflix and have naps and so on. In the long run, I don't think this huge expansion in working from home is going to stay. There's lots of disadvantages as well as the flexibility advantages, including the need to obviously liaise and cooperate with your colleagues, the need to have a proper setup, the proper equipment, proper technology, and the challenges of working from home, especially for people who are trying to combine work from home with caring responsibilities. So I do think there will be some permanent increase, but not remotely to the level that we're experiencing right now. There's other ways, of course, that work was already changing before the pandemic, and in a way the pandemic has shone big lights on them. There's been a lot of discussion, of course, in the last couple of years about automation and technology and artificial intelligence and robots and so on. I've been very skeptical of that, and we've done some work through our center trying to put that whole discussion in some context. In fact, I'm more concerned not with robots taking our jobs, but in fact with the failure of business capital investment to provide us with the equipment we need to do our jobs right. And Canada's record in terms of capital investment in machinery and equipment and innovation spending has been terrible. So in fact, on an average basis, our work is going backwards in terms of capital intensity, and we're getting too many what I would call menial or low productivity jobs, particularly in private service sectors. I'd like to see more investment in machinery and equipment and robots, but we have to manage it well and make sure that the costs and benefits of those changes are shared fairly. The other dimension that we try to bring through our center to the future of work discussion is to talk a bit about the sort of social or, if you like, class dimensions of work and how those are important. You know, it's not like we're all going to become computer programmers, and it's not like even being a computer programmer guarantees that you're going to have a good, secure living. And there's lots of ways in which I think the shape of the future of work is going to be determined by who has power and who makes the decision. And in order to build an inclusive society that most people feel part of, and that means we're a stronger and more resilient society, as we've seen in this pandemic, we're going to have to give workers some say and some leverage and some bargaining power. So part of what we'll be doing is thinking about what does a collective voice look like? How do workers have real input? How do we negotiate income distribution and technological change and all of those other issues in ways that are not just unilateral decisions by investors and employers, but that reflect broader social concerns? That will be one of the key focuses of our work at the center.
Okay. And what are your thoughts about the sectors or professions that are the jobs of the future that are different from up till this point?
Again, Andrew, I think there's a bit of a gap between the rhetoric and the reality of the future of work. You know, the rhetoric is, you know, get a STEM skill, learn the right technology, you know, be a programmer, and make sure you pick the right language to specialize in programming, you know, and you'll be taken care of. And that's all wrong for all kinds of reasons. First of all, you know, those direct high tech jobs are always going to be a small share of the overall labor market. Secondly, earning a STEM degree isn't a guarantee. And in fact, even employers will acknowledge that having someone come out of university or college with a very particular high quality technical degree may not be the best thing, because what's actually more important sometimes is the ability to learn, to be flexible, to adapt, to work in teams, to show leadership. And those are things that you don't necessarily get in one of those narrow STEM professions. So, you know, of course, we need those skills, but we need the whole range of skills. We shouldn't become STEM obsessed when we're thinking about the future of work and what kind of occupations are going to be successful. Ironically, some of the fastest growing occupations are the ones that would surprise you. Obviously, the jobs in hospitality and service sectors, or truck drivers, strangely enough, one of the fastest growing occupations. I think that human and caring services are going to be a source of strong employment growth. They already have been over the past decade. Healthcare and education work has been among the most successful and vibrant sources of new work, and I think that will continue even more so in light of what I said earlier about the growing role of the public sector in the economy.
Yeah, just quickly on services to seniors, long-term care and so forth, that we've seen a scandalous situation in recent months that have come to light that we've known about but really haven't paid much attention to. What's your best argument for turning that around and really putting some big money into that?
Yeah, I think that could be, I hope that will be one of the lasting changes from this pandemic. What's happened in our long-term care facilities is a scourge on Canada. We had one of the worst experiences of any industrial country in terms of how many deaths occurred in long-term care facilities. And, you know, in a way, it showed that some of the warnings that were there before about low-grade, cost-cutting efforts by long-term care facilities that were underfunded and in many cases privately owned. So they were guided by a profit motive, not a care motive. Also, the very, very negative consequences of precarious labor strategies. Instead of hiring people to work in those facilities on a sort of permanent full-time basis with a living wage, giving them some stability and staying power and the ability to learn and hone their skills over time. Instead of that, so many facilities, again, particularly private ones, adopted very low-grade, cost-cutting approaches using labor hire or temporary staffing agencies, part-time, irregular hours, and that forced many workers in this sector to work in multiple homes in order to pay their bills. Well, guess what? Those people were taking the coronavirus from one home to another. It's a horrible, horrible record. So I think the lessons are clear that long-term care has to be treated as a serious, legitimate healthcare service. It has to be brought under the umbrella of Medicare, and those services should be provided like other healthcare services through regulated, well-funded public institutions. That's going to be a big change, but it's also going to be a big opportunity because there will be tens of thousands of jobs, and then they will become good jobs, stable jobs, living wage jobs, providing those services, and that will leave us in infinitely better position to withstand the next pandemic when it comes, and we know it will.
Would you draw that line between retirement residences and long-term care, or would you cover retirement residences and and the kind of extended care that are provided to seniors in their homes?
Yeah, well, I mean, there's obviously a continuum, a range of levels of support there. So at one end, you've got a full long-term care facility, which absolutely should be run like a public hospital is run. Then you've got, a step or two back from that kind of assisted living type of situation. So, it's going to take some, I think, discussion and research and policy development to figure out exactly where to draw the line. But for sure, the more intensive care settings have to be brought under the umbrella of Medicare and treated like proper healthcare facilities, because that's what they are. And when we don't treat them that way, thousands of people die.
Yeah. Okay, we've got a number of questions popping in, so I'm going to try and put these to you rapid fire.
Excellent. I'll try to be rapid fire in the response, which is very unusual for me.
I know, but be assured everything you say is of interest. So good luck. So the first is, why is the stock market not falling? Is it because investors know that the government will bail them out?
Oh, that's a fascinating question. I've always been dubious that the stock market is a barometer of economic, let alone social well-being. It is, in essence, a casino. Most of the trends in the stock market, including when it was collapsing in the early days of the pandemic, are driven by the speculative impulses of the pros who dominate those casinos. And it's ironic that the stock market has rebounded so strongly. In fact, in the US, the NASDAQ at record highs. And anyone, honestly, never mind that Zoom has been successful and Amazon gets more profitable, can anyone look out at the world and say, this is the basis for a record high in the stock market? No. So that just tells you how divorced financial speculation has become from the real economy. They do know that government is bailing them out, perhaps indirectly rather than directly. Some companies are being bailed out directly, but more importantly, the huge amounts of credit that are being created through the quantitative easing system as it's currently practiced means asset prices are supported. And that has been one of the reasons that stock markets have rebounded. Some of the things that Trump did with his relief packages, including huge tax cuts for businesses, it would be another factor. But we shouldn't take from that the economy is headed in the right direction. That is not remotely what this means.
And have we got it right in Canada where the investments have been more directed to the workers as opposed to the corporations?
Yes, I think so. I mean, the direct income support through the CERB and all those other programs, the student benefit and so on, have been very important. The wage subsidy is another big government measure. Now that, strictly speaking, is paid to employers, and employers are benefiting from it, but it is tied to the well-being of workers to be kept on the payroll at 75% of their previous wage. There has been important support for businesses as well, and I'm not against that at all. I do think that there should be conditions attached to that support in terms of maintaining a presence in Canada and maintaining people on the payroll, and in some of the larger one-off rescues that are going to be required. There's no doubt about that. Government should be ambitious in tying its support to the company, the rescued company, meeting certain goals in terms of its footprint in Canada and the quality of its operations.
Okay, a question on the green economy. Could you say a little bit more about the green economy and what the government can be doing to help that as compared to the more traditional forms of investment?
Oh, very good question. In a way, this is an opportunity to really step up our commitment to transitioning away from carbon energy, which we know we have to do. That's inevitable, and the rest of the world is doing it, and Canada's had some progress, but not enough on that score. Particularly given what I said earlier about the need for government to play a very large and sustained role leading reconstruction, it's a no-brainer that there should be a focus on climate transition investments as part of that. That would include, obviously, accelerating the rollout of renewable energy sources. It would include cleanup and remediation of former polluting assets, including oil well remediation, for example, in the prairies. It would include investments in energy efficiency, public transit, housing retrofits, and so on. So that aspect of it could be immensely positive and position Canada very well for success in the low carbon future that we know has to come.
Okay, next question. Can you discuss a little bit about the debts and deficits in relation to provincial and municipal governments?
Oh, yeah, that's a very important question. We were speaking earlier about the federal deficit and debt, and it's big. But in a way, it's the lower levels of government that have a tighter fiscal vice around them. The Bank of Canada is buying large amounts of federal bonds, $5 billion a week, in fact. They're also buying provincial bonds, and this is a good thing. That has helped some of the smaller provinces make sure that they avoid any kind of credit crunch through this situation, and will help to keep interest rates low for provincial governments. I think the Bank of Canada should actually look at doing that in the direct primary market rather than just secondary purchases of those bonds. And that would, again, underscore the provincial government's ability to raise the capital that's needed for their role in the reconstruction. Municipalities, in a way, have the least wiggle room. First of all, most of them are required by law to balance their operating budget, which is a terrible situation to be in right now because their revenues are plummeting because of the crisis, and their expenses, they're ground zero for some of those public health services and other things that municipalities have to do. So they're not even legally allowed to finance those operations through debt, let alone raise the money to do so. So they're going to need help from the higher levels of government, provincially and federally. I would like to see the feds and the Bank of Canada together develop an alternative financing mechanism to support municipal budgets. That would require the provincial government's engagement because constitutionally municipalities are ruled by the provinces. But I think as long as the feds were showing their willingness to use their superior financing capacities to deliver resources more than they have so far to the kind of ground zero at the municipal level, then I don't think the provinces would argue with that. And that'll be really important to preserve municipal level public services and preserve municipal level jobs, frankly. If we have a situation where cities and city funded agencies, let alone the provinces, start laying off thousands of workers because they literally have no money, then again, we're turning a recession into a depression.
Do you see that happening? That's a pretty big idea, but probably one of the only ones I've heard in terms of municipalities, because municipalities are really in a crisis, and that crisis is about to blow up across the country.
Yeah, I mean, I've looked at some of the data from the FCM, the Federation of Canadian Municipalities, and other sources, and I think the 10 biggest cities alone are looking at $3 or $4 billion operating deficits this year. And if they tried to cover that deficit by raising property taxes, you'd be looking at humongous tax increases, 20, 30, 40% in the middle of a crisis. That makes no sense either. Just as laying off public servants and closing down public services makes no sense. So, the most immediate thing that should happen is the provinces who govern municipalities should ride to the rescue, including provision of emergency aid and relaxing those legal restrictions that cities can't run deficits. Those restrictions don't make sense at the best of times, and they're a recipe for disaster today. The feds, though, are the ones that have the easiest and cheapest ability to raise funds. So directly or indirectly, the feds should find a way to get that money to the cities. And I know there's been some announcements from Ottawa. It's been very little so far, but the provinces should be cooperative in finding ways to channel the money that the Bank of Canada and the federal government can raise down to the municipal level as quickly as possible.
Okay, I think I'll try and have just two more questions. Is this the time to finally impose wealth and inheritance taxes?
I've heard a lot of talk about wealth taxes during the crisis, and as a left-wing nut bar economist, I'm naturally predisposed to those ideas. I'm not convinced, frankly, that even a progressive wealth tax is what is needed at this precise moment. I think down the road, of course, in the long run, as a way of helping to fund public services in a normal world, a wealth tax makes sense. But remember, any tax increase, even a tax aimed at rich people, has contractionary macroeconomic impacts. And so, first of all, if we tried to raise a bunch of money through a wealth tax, we would be, in a way, worsening the macroeconomic problems that we're in. Secondly, I think inadvertently it buys into this knee-jerk obsession with debts and deficits that we want to avoid. I don't think that we need to worry about paying this current deficit, whether it's by wealth tax or some other reason. And emphasizing wealth tax as a way to pay for the cost of the pandemic, I think inadvertently reinforces that kind of knee-jerk austerity frame that I'm really intent on making sure doesn't come to the fore.
Okay, and basic income, is this the time to be talking about basic income after our experience with CERB?
Right, that's another idea where we're having lots of discussion, and I think there's more potential in that. The CERB, interestingly enough, has some features that are kind of like a basic income, and in that regard is much better than the employment insurance system. The government moved quickly, recognizing EI was so full of holes, most Canadians were going to fall right through it. It wasn't a safety net at all anymore. It was a few strands because of the many flaws in its design. And give them credit for developing and implementing so quickly a massive new program that has kept millions of Canadians afloat and in their homes, frankly. So now the CERB is an emergency measure. It's not going to be permanent, but I think aspects of it should be maintained in whatever new income support system we come out of this pandemic with, because we certainly can't go back to EI. So maintaining some of the features like better accessibility to the program, a threshold level of benefits that is close to enough to get to the poverty line for a single person, and some of those features, and then combining that maybe in a kind of a hybrid model with some of the previous provisions of employment insurance, such as benefits that are tied to how much you made before you were unemployed. Something like that, I think, has a lot of potential in the next couple of years.
Okay, and this is the last question. Tomorrow, Bill Morneau is going to deliver this economic update snapshot. What do you want to see? What are your recommendations to him as to what he should be talking about tomorrow?
Right. Yeah, well, most of the interest will be on his simple reporting, providing an update on where federal finances are at. And he's going to have a big number to announce in terms of the estimated deficit, somewhere between 250 and 300 billion for the year. 2/3 of that is due to the increase in spending that they quickly brought in during the pandemic, and rightly so. 1/3 of it will be due to a loss in revenue because of the economic downturn. I'm less interested in what that number is. I know it's going to be big. I'm more interested in seeing some signals from Mr. Morneau that he's thinking long term about what's going to be required. That issue of the long run reconstruction program that I think the economy will need. He's not going to make policy announcements tomorrow, but I would like to see him start to discuss the long term plan for repairing and reconstructing the economy, and the federal government is going to have to play a huge role in that. He cannot treat this as a short-term emergency or a normal cyclical downturn. This was a catastrophe, and we're going to need government to lead a very sustained, ambitious, and expensive reconstruction program, even once the immediate health emergency is passed.
Well, thank you very much, Jim Stanford. This has been an incredible discussion. We could go on for a long while. I think your last comments are important. You have indeed been advised the current and many past finance ministers, and I think often they take your recommendations, and sometimes they don't. I'll just tell you on the question of the definition, I don't go the nut bar route. I'll just say you proved today once again that you are indeed a very credible progressive economist, and we're really happy that you're back in Canada, sharing your thoughts, views, and analysis with us. So
I'm really happy to be back, Andrew. Thank you so much for having me in the program today. Thank you.
Pleasure. I've just got a few quick announcements to make before we leave about a few more webinars coming up. So on July the 9th, which is this Thursday, we have a webinar on basic income, the issue we just touched on briefly today. We will have Sheila Reguer, who's the head of the Basic Income Network, Terence Hunsley, a senior fellow of the Pearson Center, Senator Francis Lankin, and former MP Robert Falcon discuss basic income. On July the 14th, which is next Tuesday, we'll have a conversation with Infrastructure Minister Catherine McKenna. She will be having that conversation with Brian Gallant, who's also a member of our advisory board and the former Premier of New Brunswick. Next Friday, on July the 17th, we have a conversation with the Chinese ambassador, Mr. Tsung Pei-Wu, and that will be moderated by Professor Jonathan Kaloff, who's a member of our advisory board. And we've just confirmed for August the 11th a conversation with Marco Mendicino, the Minister of Immigration. We'll be talking to him about COVID, economic recovery, and immigration. So those are the next four. Again, thank you very much, Jim, and great to have you back in Canada.
Okay,
Thanks
thank
everybody for joining us. Please keep in touch. Thank you.